Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're getting into a subject that's, well, generated a lot of political heat over the last decade. We're talking about the real economic impact of the UK leaving the European Union. Forget the noise, forget the politics for a moment. Our mission here is to cut through all that and look at the hard data, what your sources actually tell us.
Exactly. And it's the only way to get a clearer view, really, because the big challenge, analytically speaking, is separating the specific Brexit effect from all those huge global shocks. You know, the pandemic, supply chains going haywire, the energy crisis. Every advanced economy faced those.
Right. So how do you isolate it?
Well, the key is comparison. We focus on how the UK has performed relative to its G7 peers. They face the same global storm, so the difference in performance, that points towards the specific UK factors.
Okay. And what the sources showed really shifted my perspective. It wasn't the kind of sudden crash some people maybe feared back in 2016. It's something else.
Yeah, it's more structural. The analogy that the analysis uses, and I think it's quite powerful, is this idea of a slow puncture for the economy.
A slow puncture. Explain that a bit more.
It means it's not a single dramatic event. It's more like a persistent leak, a structural drag that doesn't always show up starkly in one quarter's GDP figures. But it bleeds growth over time. It changes the UK's long-term trajectory compared to where it might have been and compared to its peers.
Okay, so let's talk about that slow puncture then. Part one, the big macroeconomic headwinds. How does this show up, especially for living standards? Because we often hear about UK growth figures, but there's a big caveat, isn't there? This idea that headline GDP is being flattered by a booming population.
That's the crucial point. You absolutely have to adjust for population. If you want to know if the average person is actually getting better off, if living standards are rising,
you need GDP per person.
Exactly, GDP per person. And that metric, which is, the best measure we have for living standards, it's basically been stagnant, actually worse than stagnant. Between late 2019 and early 2024, UK GDP per person actually fell by 1.2%, cumulatively.
Wow, fell by 1.2%. And that really highlights the difference compared to others, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The U.S. economy, 13% larger than pre-pandemic, the Eurozone up 6%. The UK's recovery looks very sluggish in that light.
It does. It suggests that underlying structural headwind is real. And that brings us right to the core issue identified in the analysis, productivity.
And the government's own fiscal watchdog, the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility, they've been pretty consistent on this, haven't they?
Very consistent. Their central forecast, repeated over time, is that this trade and cooperation agreement, the TCA, the deal we have now, it will reduce the UK's long-run productivity by 4% compared to if we'd stayed in the EU.
4%. Now that sounds a bit academic, perhaps. Could you translate that? What does a 4% productivity hit actually mean in real terms, say, for the national budget?
Well, that 4% loss is, you could say, the ghost haunting the public finances. It translates directly into a massive hole in national income. We're talking about roughly $40 billion in annual tax revenues that the economy just isn't generating anymore compared to the counterfactual.
40 billion pounds a year.
Yeah. And this shortfall is repeatedly cited in the analysis as the main structural driver behind the significant tax rises we've seen since 2019. It's trying to fill that hole.
Okay. And that's the long-term structural hit.
Yeah.
But there was also an immediate shock, wasn't there? Back in 2016, the moment the referendum result came in. Sterling.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. A sharp shock. Sterling dropped by about 10% almost overnight. And the thing is, that devaluation didn't really boost exports in a sustained way, certainly not immediately. Businesses couldn't just pivot that fast, but imports, they instantly became 10% more expensive.
So a purely inflationary shock then?
Pretty much. The analysis estimates that initial devaluation added something like 2 to 3 percentage points to UK inflation. For the average household, that cost worked out at around £870, just from the currency move.
Right, and that was the initial hit. But the analysis argues the new structural friction, the red tape from the TCA, that's kept inflation higher than it might have been.
Yes, it's compounded the problem.
Right.
All those new non-tariff barriers, the customs checks, the paperwork, that adds costs throughout the supply chain. The sources point to specific research suggesting Brexit was responsible for about a 6% increase in UK food prices over 2020 and 2021 alone.
6% on food.
And those are costs baked into the system now. They don't just disappear when, say, global energy prices fall. It's a structural increase in the cost base.
Okay, so that's the macro picture, the slow puncture. Let's move to part two. trade, because the trade data really shows where that puncture is, doesn't it?
It really does. The OBR and other analysts too, they forecast about a 15% long-run reduction in UK trade intensity. And trade intensity, just to remind everyone, is simply exports plus imports as a share of GDP. It measures how open the economy is to trade.
And are those forecasts playing out?
Well, look at the divergence. Since 2019, overall UK trade volumes have barely grown, up just 1%. Over the same period, the rest of the G7 and the EU27 saw their trade volumes expand by about 8%.
So the UK's basically been left behind in the global trade recovery post-pandemic.
Pretty much, yes. But what's really fascinating when you dig into the UK numbers is the huge split, a tale of two sectors, really. Goods trade versus services trade.
Ah, yes, this was striking. Why the massive difference? Services seem to have done okay, even well, but goods, not so much.
It comes down to the specifics of the TCA. The deal was designed primarily to get rid of tariffs, customs duties on goods, which sounds good.
But tariffs were already quite low for most things.
Exactly. Tariffs weren't the main barrier. The real change was the introduction of vast new non-tariff barriers for goods. Customs declarations, rules of origin checks, regulatory hurdles, mountains of new bureaucracy. The deal, however, did relatively little for services trade, so that sector wasn't hit by the same level of new friction, and its existing strengths could shine through.
And the results are stark. Goods trade.
Exceptionally weak. Goods exports actually contracted by 13.2% between 2019 and 2023. We're talking levels not seen since 2015.
13% drop in goods exports. Wow. But services?
A completely different story. The UK is still a global powerhouse and services' second largest exporter in the world. And UK services exports soared. They grew by 14.0% between 2019 and 2023. That's actually faster growth than France, the US, or Japan saw in their services exports.
14% growth. That really is a contrast. But this directly challenges that whole narrative of global Britain, doesn't it? The idea that new trade deals around the world would make up for any lost trade with the EU.
Well, the sources are pretty blunt on this. It crashes into the basic reality of economic gravity. You trade most with who's big and close. And the government's own impact assessments for these new deals show the mismatch in scale.
Give us the numbers. The Australia deal.
The Australia Free Trade Agreement. Projected long-run GDP gain. Just 0.08%.
No, not 8%. And joining the CPTPP, the Pacific Trade Bloc.
Estimated long-run GDP gain, 0.09%.
Right. I remember seeing that stark comparison in the analysis. It was something like, we potentially lose 4% of GDP from leaving the EU structure, and we gain double 0.08% from the Australia deal. The numbers just don't add up for compensation.
The arithmetic is inescapable, really. These deals are positive in themselves, perhaps, but they are orders of magnitude too small to offset the impact of introducing friction with our largest and nearest trading partner.
Okay, so that leads us neatly into part 3, investment. Because weak trade, lower productivity, that logically feeds into business investment, doesn't it? The engine for future growth.
Absolutely. And here again, the divergence between the UK and its G7 peers is really quite striking. Since the referendum in mid-2016, UK business investment has basically flatlined. It grew only 1.9% over that entire period up to early 2024.
Just 1.9% growth since 2016. How does that compare?
Well, over the same period, US business investment grew 19.5%. France saw growth of 18.7%.
19% versus less than 2%. That's sluggish, that's stagnation. What's the main cause identified?
One word, really, uncertainty. Prolonged, profound uncertainty about the future trading relationship, the regulatory environment. Businesses just held back. They paused investment decisions. They canceled projects.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because the analysis suggests a huge chunk of the total economic damage happened before the deal was even finalized.
That's right. The OBR estimates that about 2/5, 40% of that total 4% long-run productivity hit actually occurred before the TCA was implemented in 2021.
Just from the uncertainty itself.
Just from the uncertainty, years of not knowing the rules of the game, it acted like a tax, a direct brake on capital investment, even before the new trade friction kicked in.
And while big multinational companies might have the resources to navigate that kind of uncertainty or absorb the costs, it hits smaller businesses hardest, doesn't it? SMEs.
Disproportionately so. For small and medium-sized enterprises, the end of frictionless trade really did erect what the sources call a red tape curtain.
Let's talk about that red tape. What kind of costs are we looking at?
Well, the administrative burden is just astronomical. Take customs declarations. The estimate is around 270 million new forms are needed annually for UK-EU trade.
270 million.
And the estimated annual cost of processing all that paperwork is around 15 billion, just on customs forms. Think about that, a 15 billion annual administrative tax on trade.
15 billion. And then there's something called rules of origin, which sounds complex but seems to cause real headaches. Why do they matter if tariffs are zero?
Because even with zero tariffs, you have to prove where your product and, crucially, its components were made. It's about eligibility for that zero tariff. So if your UK-made product uses too many components sourced from outside the UK or EU, suddenly it might not qualify for zero tariffs when you export it to the EU. You could face tariffs, and you have this incredibly complex paperwork to demonstrate origin.
So it turns logistics into a major customs compliance issue.
Exactly. And you see the real-world impact in some of the anecdotes reported. You know, the tea company whose shipment got stuck in customs for 12 weeks. The small jewelry firm whose delivery times to EU customers went from a reliable 2 days to, suddenly, 21 days.
It basically makes exporting unviable for some small firms.
It can, yes. Or at least much less profitable and much more hassle. Which leads, logically, to the next step for many, economic relocation.
What do you mean by that?
Well, the rational business response, if you're facing persistent delays and costs exporting from the UK, isn't necessarily to stop selling to the EU. It's to set up a base inside the EU single market. So that jewelry company, for instance, ended up setting up a distribution hub in Poland. They ship in bulk to Poland, then distribute to EU customers from there.
Right, so the goods bypass a lot of the UK infrastructure.
Yeah.
Less warehousing needed here, different freight partners used, potentially fewer UK jobs involved in that EU-facing side of the business.
Precisely. It's a direct relocation of economic activity driven by the new trade barriers. It makes perfect business sense for the individual firm, but it represents a loss for the UK economy overall.
And there's a longer-term danger here too, isn't there, about the pipeline for future exporters?
Yes, the sources raise this concern. The EU single market used to be a sort of low-risk nursery slope for small British companies wanting to dip their toes into exporting. It was easy, frictionless. By making that first step exporting to our nearest neighbors so much more complex and costly, you effectively block that pathway for a whole generation of potential future exporters. You make it harder for SMEs to scale internationally.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly. Part 4. Labor, skills, and a very interesting control group. The stated goal of ending free movement was partly to restrict the supply of lower-wage labor, right? To try and force a shift towards a high-wage, high-skill economy.
That was the theory, yes. Limit the supply of labor, wages go up, and firms are incentivized to invest in automation, training, and productivity improvements to compensate.
And what's the reality been, according to the analysis?
Well, the first part happened. We have seen acute and persistent labor shortages, especially in sectors that were heavily reliant on EU labor. Think hospitality, agriculture, construction.
Construction didn't something like 3/4 of firms report struggling to recruit.
Yes, 76% in one survey. And social care is another sector facing enormous pressure, so the shortages are real. And that did push up nominal wages pay, grew about 4.7% in the period studied.
So higher wages. But what about the second part of the theory? The crucial investment in automation and training to boost productivity.
That's where it seems to have fallen down. Because of all the uncertainty and the freeze on capital investment we just discussed, that crucial productivity-enhancing investment hasn't really materialized at scale.
So firms are just left with higher wage bills, but without the productivity gains to pay for them.
Exactly. You end up with higher labor costs, but no corresponding increase in output per worker. The analysis calls this a stagflationary outcome. Higher costs, stagnant output. It's the opposite of the dynamic, high-skill, high-productivity economy that was hoped for.
Right. Not the intended consequence. Now let's talk about Northern Ireland, because it serves as a fascinating, almost accidental control group in all this.
It really does. Because of the unique arrangements under the Windsor Framework, Northern Ireland effectively remains aligned with the EU single market for goods. It has dual market access, frictionless trade, with both Great Britain and the EU single market.
So it kept the kind of core trading position for goods that the whole UK used to have before Brexit.
Essentially, yes, for goods trade.
And what happened? How did Northern Ireland's economy perform compared to the rest of the UK, which did face the new barriers with the EU?
A really notable outperformance. In 2023, Northern Ireland recorded the largest increase in real GDP of any UK region. It grew by 2.1%.
2.1% growth in Northern Ireland? compared to the UK overall figure.
Just 0.3% growth for the UK as a whole in 2023.
Wow, that's a significant difference. And the analysis attributes that directly to retaining single market access.
That's the strong implication from the sources, yes. It's widely seen as empirical evidence of the economic value of that frictionless trade relationship. It demonstrates, in practice, what was lost by the rest of Great Britain in terms of goods trade potential.
Okay, so bring this towards a conclusion. Part 5, policy outlook and strategic realities. Given all this accumulating economic evidence, has the political debate shifted at all?
I think it has, subtly perhaps, but importantly, you see less of the really intense polarization from a few years ago. The debate now seems less about if Brexit has costs and more about how those costs should be managed. There's maybe a move towards pragmatism.
But that pragmatism operates within strict limits, right? There are clear political red lines.
Very clear red lines, yes. Shared across the main political parties, it seems. Absolutely no return to the single market as a member, no return to the customs union, and no return to freedom of movement. Those seem politically off the table.
So any policy changes are likely to be about smoothing the edges of the current deal rather than fundamentally changing their relationship.
That appears to be the focus. Things like negotiating a sanitary and phytosanitary, or SPS, agreement.
Explain SPS quickly for us.
Sure. It covers food standards, animal health, plant health regulations, basically aligning rules or recognizing each other's standards to reduce the need for physical checks on food and agricultural products at the border. It would ease trade, particularly for farmers and food producers.
Okay, so deals like SPS, maybe mutual recognition of professional qualifications, things to reduce friction within the current framework.
Exactly. Pragmatic fixes aiming to reduce some of the bureaucracy and costs, but not a structural reset of the relationship.
So for a listener, maybe running a business that trades with the EU, what's the key strategic takeaway from the analysis? What should they be planning for?
The advice coming through is pretty clear. Anchor your medium-term planning on what they call a hard TCA baseline. Assume the current level of friction, the current barriers, are here to stay indefinitely. Don't bank on major easements happening soon.
And for businesses where EU trade is really core,
the analysis strongly reiterates the strategic logic we discussed earlier. Seriously, consider investing in some kind of EU presence, whether that's a subsidiary, a distribution hub, whatever fits the business model. It's about de-risking your operations and maintaining access to that market.
Okay, and one final point, the promised Brexit dividend from deregulation. The government announced savings from a smarter regulation package. How does that stack up against the costs?
Well, the government projected savings of around £1 billion a year from this package, which sounds like a lot.
Right.
But remember, that estimated $15 billion annual cost just from the new customs declarations, that $1 billion saving is less than 7% of that single cost element alone.
So the scale is just completely mismatched.
That's the conclusion of the analysis, yes. The regulatory dividend, so far at least, hasn't materialized on anything like the scale needed to offset the structural costs of the new trade friction.
Right. So, to synthesize everything we've discussed, what we're left with is this picture of a demonstrable slow puncture, a structural economic drag, quantified most clearly perhaps by that OBR estimate of a 4% long-run hit to productivity. And that hit translates directly into stagnant living standards, pressure on public finances, and a lower long-term growth path compared to the UK's peers.
Yes, the economic data seems quite clear on the direction of travel. The friction costs are real, they appear structural under current arrangements, and businesses and the economy are adjusting to that new reality. Unless there are fundamental policy changes, this is the baseline.
Which leaves us, and you the listener, with this final, perhaps provocative thought to consider. It seems the core conflict shaping the UK's economic future now is this gap. The gap between what might be economically optimal, which probably involves reducing friction with our largest trading partner, and what is currently seen as politically achievable, given those firm red lines around sovereignty. Which of those two powerful forces, economic necessity or political constraints, will ultimately win out and define the UK's long-term trajectory? Something to think about. We'd encourage you to explore the data comparisons for yourself.